Hook, it's a family heirloom, he'd say whenever I tried to remove the strange bracelet with runic symbols. Yesterday, it accidentally came undone, and memories of another family, another home, another life came flooding back. The bracelet had been part of me for as long as I could remember. Heavy, cold metal that left permanent indentations on my wrist from years of wearing it. The symbols etched into its surface looked ancient, mysterious, like something you'd see in a museum or fantasy movie. Whenever I asked about taking it off, even just for a shower or to sleep more comfortably, he'd get this look in his eyes. Not angry exactly, but urgent. Desperate, even. I was rushing to get ready for work yesterday morning, running late as usual, when I caught the bracelet on my bedroom door handle. The metal made this awful screeching sound against the wood, and suddenly, click. It just fell right off my wrist, landing on the hardwood floor with a dull thud. The moment it hit the ground, everything changed. It started as flashes, quick images that didn't make sense. A woman's face, kind eyes, dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. She was crying, reaching for me, but I couldn't understand why. Then came the voices, distant but growing clearer. A man calling a name that wasn't mine, panic in his voice. The smell of fresh-cut grass and playground equipment. Swings creaking in the wind. I stood there in my bedroom, staring at the bracelet on the floor, as more memories crashed into my consciousness like waves. A yellow house with white shutters. A dog, some kind of golden retriever mix, who would lick my face every morning. Birthday parties with kids I'd never seen before, but somehow knew. Their faces were so familiar it hurt. The strangest part was how real it all felt. More real than the memories I'd grown up with. Those felt foggy now, distant, like trying to remember a dream. But these new ones were sharp, vivid, filled with emotion and detail that made my chest ache. I picked up the bracelet with shaking hands. The moment my skin touched the metal, the new memory started to fade, becoming fuzzy around the edges. I dropped it immediately, and they came rushing back, clearer than before. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I called in sick to work. I couldn't function, couldn't think about anything except these memories that felt more like mine than anything I'd ever experienced. The woman's face kept appearing in my mind. She had my nose, my chin. The same small scar above her left eyebrow that I had above mine. By afternoon, I was tearing through the house looking for answers. He wouldn't be home for hours, and I needed to understand what was happening to me. I'd lived in this house my entire life, but suddenly it felt foreign, like I was seeing it for the first time. The family photos on the mantel looked staged. The childhood bedroom felt too clean, too perfect, like a display room rather than a place where a real child had grown up. I started in his bedroom, going through drawers and closets with growing desperation. Most of it was normal stuff. Clothes, old bills, prescription bottles. But at the back of his closet, behind a stack of winter coats, I found a small filing cabinet I'd never noticed before. It was locked, but the lock was old and flimsy. I managed to pry it open with a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer. Inside were folders. Lots of them. Each one labeled with dates going back over 15 years. My hands were trembling as I pulled out the first one. The photographs hit me like a physical blow. Me, but younger, maybe 3 or 4 years old, playing in a park I'd never seen before. But it wasn't just me in the photos. There were the people from my recovered memories. The woman with the kind eyes, the man who'd been calling that other name. They were holding me, playing with me, looking at me with such obvious love it made my throat tight. Underneath the photos were documents. Police reports. Missing child flyers with my face on them, but with a different name. A name that felt right in a way my current name never had. The reports detailed a kidnapping from a public park. A 3-year-old who vanished while playing on the swings. Parents who never stopped searching. But the worst part was the other documents. Official-looking papers with letterheads from some kind of research facility. Reports about memory suppression experiments. Psychological conditioning protocols. And my name, my real name, listed as Subject 47. The reports were clinical, cold, describing me like a lab rat. They detailed how certain electromagnetic frequencies could disrupt memory formation in young children. How repeated exposure could essentially erase entire portions of someone's past. How a device, specifically described as a modified electromagnetic bracelet, could maintain this suppression indefinitely. I sat on his bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of the most horrific betrayal imaginable, and tried to process what I was reading. The man I'd called father my entire life had stolen me. He'd worked at some kind of experimental facility, had access to technology that could mess with people's minds, and he'd used it on me. The final document in the folder was a progress report dated just 2 weeks ago. It talked about Phase 3 of something called Identity Integration Protocol. According to the notes, I was almost ready for final conditioning, whatever that meant. The report mentioned that my compliance levels were optimal, that the false memory implants had fully integrated, and that I showed no signs of remembering my previous identity. That's when I heard his car in the driveway. Update 1. I barely managed to get everything back in the filing cabinet and close his bedroom door before I heard his key in the front door. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd be able to hear it. I grabbed the bracelet from my bedroom floor and shoved it in my pocket, then tried to act normal. But how do you act normal when you've just learned your entire life is a lie? He called out my name, the fake name he'd given me, as he walked through the front door. I managed to answer back, tried to keep my voice steady, but inside I was screaming. This man who'd raised me, who I loved and trusted, had kidnapped me, had stolen me from my real family and erased my memories of them. Dinner was the longest hour of my life. I sat across from him at the kitchen table we'd eaten at thousands of times before, trying to act like nothing had changed. He asked about my day, made small talk about work, complained about traffic. All normal things. All things a real father might say to their daughter. But I kept staring at his hands as he cut his food. Those hands had put the bracelet on me. Those hands had stolen me from a playground 15 years ago. Those hands had been part of experiments on children. The worst part was how normal he seemed. How concerned he looked when he noticed I wasn't eating much. He even asked if I was feeling okay, if I might be coming down with something. The caring tone in his voice made me feel sick. I excused myself early, said I had a headache and wanted to lie down. He offered to bring me some tea, asked if I needed anything from the store. Playing the perfect father role right up until the end. In my room that night, I took the bracelet out of my pocket and stared at it. Such a small thing to have controlled my entire existence. I thought about putting it back on. The memories of my real family were painful, confusing, overwhelming. It would be easier to just slip it back onto my wrist and forget everything I'd learned. But I couldn't. Those people in the photographs, my real parents, they were still out there somewhere. Still searching for me, probably. Still hoping their little girl would come home someday. I spent the night looking through the files I'd managed to photograph with my phone before he got home. The research facility was called Cognitive Development Solutions. From what I could piece together, it was some kind of government-funded program studying memory manipulation in children. The official purpose was supposed to be helping kids who'd experienced trauma, but the documents I found suggested something much darker. There were references to other subjects, other children. Some of the reports mentioned unsuccessful integrations and subjects requiring termination of study. I tried not to think too hard about what that might mean. By morning, I'd made my decision. I had to find my real parents. The police reports from 15 years ago had their names, their last known address. I called in sick to work again and drove across town to the neighborhood where I'd been taken from. It was about an hour away, in a completely different part of the city than where I'd grown up. The house from the address was still there, but it looked different than in my recovered memories. Smaller, sadder. The yellow paint was faded and peeling. The garden that I remembered being full of flowers was overgrown with weeds. I sat in my car across the street for almost an hour, trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. What would I even say? How do you explain to parents that their kidnapped daughter has been living 40 minutes away this entire time? But the decision was made for me. A woman came out of the house, older now, grayer, but unmistakably the same person from the photographs. The same person from my recovered memories. She was checking the mail when she looked up and saw me sitting in my car. Our eyes met across the street, and I watched her face change. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that might have been hope. She dropped the mail and started walking toward my car. I got out slowly, my legs shaking. We stood there on the sidewalk, staring at each other. She was crying, not the desperate, panicked tears from my memories, but quiet, disbelieving tears. She whispered my real name, the name from the police reports, the name that felt right in a way nothing else ever had. I nodded, and she collapsed. Just fell right there on the sidewalk, sobbing. I caught her, held her, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Update 2. The reunion with my real parents was everything I'd hoped for and absolutely nothing like I'd expected. My mother, my actual mother, held me for what felt like hours while we both cried. My father came running out of the house when he heard the commotion, and the look on his face when he saw me will stay with me forever. Pure joy mixed with disbelief, like he was seeing a ghost. But along with the joy came guilt. Overwhelming, crushing guilt that I'd been living a normal life just an hour away while they'd been suffering. They showed me what the past 15 years had been like for them. The bedroom they'd kept exactly as I'd left it. The birthday cakes they'd made every year, just in case I came home. The thousands of flyers they'd posted, the private investigators they'd hired, the sleepless nights spent wondering if I was alive. My mother had quit her job to search for me full-time for the first 5 years. My father had remortgaged their house twice to pay for investigators and reward money. They'd never given up hope, but I could see how the years of not knowing had aged them, worn them down in ways that went beyond just getting older. The hardest part was explaining where I'd been. How do you tell parents that their child has been living with the man who took her? That she'd been calling him father, loving him, trusting him completely? But they listened. They held my hands while I told them about the bracelet, about the memory suppression, about the research facility. My father's face went through so many emotions: anger, horror, disbelief, protective fury. My mother just kept touching my face, like she couldn't quite believe I was real. They wanted to call the police immediately, but I stopped them. I needed to go back. I needed to confront him first, to understand why he'd done this. And honestly, I was terrified of what might happen if authorities got involved before I had all the answers. What if there were other victims? What if there was more to this than just one stolen child? We spent the day sharing memories. They showed me videos from before I was taken, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, random Tuesday afternoons. Watching myself as a 3-year-old, laughing and playing with parents I'd forgotten, was surreal and heartbreaking. I could see echoes of that child in my recovered memories, but 15 years of suppression had stolen so much. They told me about my personality before the kidnapping, how I'd been obsessed with butterflies, how I'd insisted on wearing my hair in pigtails every day, how I'd made up elaborate stories about imaginary friends. None of that had carried over into my life with him. He'd literally stolen not just my past, but pieces of who I was meant to be. By evening, I knew I had to go back to his house. I couldn't just disappear. He'd know something was wrong, and who knew what he might do. My parents begged me not to go, but I convinced them it was the only way. I promised to call them every few hours, to leave if things felt dangerous. The drive back to his house felt like traveling to another planet. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt real anymore. The neighborhood where I'd grown up, the streets I'd walked thousands of times, the house I'd called home, all of it felt like an elaborate movie set now that I knew the truth. He was in the living room when I got back, watching TV like nothing had changed. He looked up when I walked in, smiled, asked how I was feeling. Still playing the concerned father role perfectly. I sat down across from him and just stared. This man who'd tucked me in at night, who'd helped me with homework, who'd taught me to drive, who'd been at every school play and graduation, he built all of that on a foundation of stolen identity and suppressed memories. He must have noticed something in my expression because his smile faded. He asked if something was wrong, if I wanted to talk about whatever was bothering me. That's when I pulled the bracelet out of my pocket and set it on the coffee table between us. The change in his face was immediate and terrifying. The mask of concerned father disappeared completely, replaced by something cold and calculating. He didn't try to deny it, didn't pretend he didn't know what it meant. He just stared at the bracelet, then at me, and I could practically see him running through his options. He asked how long I'd had it off. When I told him since yesterday morning, he actually laughed. Not a pleasant laugh, something bitter and almost impressed. He told me he'd been wondering when this day would come. Said he'd known the bracelet wouldn't work forever, that eventually my real memories would be too strong to suppress completely. But he'd hoped for a few more years. Then he started talking, and what he told me was somehow even worse than what I'd already discovered. The research facility wasn't just studying memory suppression. They were trying to create perfect candidates for deep cover operations. Children who could be given completely new identities, new personalities, new loyalties. The government wanted agents who truly believed they were someone else, because those kinds of deep cover identities were nearly impossible to break. I wasn't just a victim. I was a prototype. He'd taken me because I fit the psychological profile they were looking for. The right age, the right personality markers, the right family situation, parents who were loving but not wealthy or connected enough to make my disappearance a national news story. The plan had been to spend 15 years creating a completely new person, then activate me for whatever mission they had in mind. The final phase mentioned in the reports wasn't just about completing my conditioning, it was about preparing me for deployment. He'd never meant to keep me as his daughter. I was supposed to be a weapon, but somewhere along the way, something had changed. He'd started actually caring about me, started seeing me as his real daughter instead of just an assignment. He'd begun sabotaging his own reports, making it seem like my conditioning wasn't progressing as quickly as it actually was. The facility had been shut down 3 years ago after some kind of scandal, but he'd never reported that my conditioning was complete. He'd wanted to keep me, to just live a normal life and pretend none of it had ever happened. As he talked, I felt this strange mix of emotions. Horror at what he'd done, but also confusion because this man had genuinely loved me, had raised me, had been the only father I'd known for 15 years. The relationship was built on lies and stolen identity, but the day-to-day reality of growing up with him had included real affection, real care. But then he said something that shattered whatever complicated sympathy I might have been feeling. He told me he still had the activation codes, the specific electromagnetic frequencies and psychological triggers that could override my recovered memories and make me compliant again. He said the bracelet was just the maintenance system. He had ways to completely reset my personality if he needed to. And he said he was considering using them. Final update. The moment he mentioned the activation codes, everything clicked into place. The strange humming I'd been hearing from the bracelet, the way my reflection had looked different that morning. He'd already started trying to reactivate the conditioning. I realized I was in immediate danger. This man who'd raised me, who I'd loved and trusted, was talking about essentially murdering my personality and turning me into some kind of programmable agent. The Caring Father act had been just that, an act he'd gotten too comfortable playing. I told him I needed time to think, that this was all too much to process. He seemed to buy it, probably because he thought he still had control over the situation. He even hugged me goodnight, told me we'd figure everything out together. The hypocrisy of it made my skin crawl. But I learned to be a good actress over the years. I went in my room, texted my real parents that I was okay, and started planning. I couldn't just run. If what he'd told me was true, there might be other victims out there. Other children who'd been taken and conditioned, other families destroyed by this program. And he still had whatever equipment he was using to try to reactivate my conditioning. He could use it on someone else. I waited until I was sure he was asleep, then snuck back into his room. The filing cabinet was still there, but when I opened it, half the files were gone. He'd been destroying evidence while I was out meeting my real parents. But he'd missed something. In the very back of the bottom drawer, there was a small notebook filled with handwritten notes. Names, dates, locations, and what looked like activation codes for multiple subjects. I wasn't the only one. There had been at least 12 other children in the program, maybe more. Some of the entries had notes like integration successful or subject deployed. But others said things like integration failed, subject terminated, or psychological break, study discontinued. I photographed every page, then put the notebook back exactly where I'd found it. The next morning, I acted normal. Made breakfast, talked about my plans for the day, even let him put his arm around me when he said goodbye for work. But the moment his car disappeared around the corner, I was on the phone with my real parents. We met at the police station. Not the local cops. My father had done research and found a detective who specialized in human trafficking and organized crime. Someone who would understand the scope of what we were dealing with. The detective listened to everything, looked through all the evidence I'd gathered, and immediately called in federal agents. Apparently, the research facility I'd found mentioned in the documents had been under investigation for years, but they'd never been able to find victims or witnesses. I was their first real break in the case. The next few hours were a blur of interviews, statements, and briefings. Federal agents, psychologists, victim advocates, everyone wanted to hear my story, to understand how the conditioning had worked, to learn about the other potential victims. But the hardest part was when they asked if I'd be willing to go back to the house one more time. They needed to gather evidence, and they thought he might be less suspicious if I was there acting normal. I agreed, but only if my real parents could be nearby, only if there were agents watching the house, only if I had a way to signal if things went wrong. That afternoon, I went home one last time. He was waiting for me when I walked in. Not in the living room watching TV like usual, but standing in the hallway like he'd been expecting me. The look on his face told me he knew something was wrong. He asked where I'd been all day. I started to give him the story we'd prepared, that I'd gone to see a movie, needed time to think, but he cut me off. He knew. Somehow, he'd figured out that I'd gone to the police. That's when I saw the device in his hand. It looked like a modified cell phone, but with strange attachments and a small screen showing frequency readouts. The activation device he'd told me about. He said he was sorry, that he'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, but he couldn't let me destroy everything he'd built. He said once the reset was complete, I'd be his daughter again, and we could go somewhere far away and start over. He pressed a button on the device, and immediately I felt this strange pressure in my head, like someone was pushing against the inside of my skull. The recovered memories started to feel fuzzy again, distant. But something had changed since I'd taken the bracelet off. The memories were stronger now, more firmly rooted, and I was ready for this. I prepared a signal for the agents watching the house, opening and closing the front blinds 3 times. But I couldn't get to the window. He was standing between me and any escape route, holding that device like a weapon. That's when I remembered something from the research notes. The conditioning only worked if the subject was compliant. If I fought it, if I focused on my real memories instead of trying to suppress the mental pressure, the device couldn't complete the reset. So I started talking, out loud, to myself, reciting every real memory I could grab onto. My mother's face, my father's voice, the yellow house with white shutters, the golden retriever, birthday parties with kids whose names I was starting to remember. He realized what I was doing and turned up the device. The pressure in my head became almost unbearable, but I kept talking, kept focusing on who I really was, not who he tried to make me. Then I heard car doors slamming outside. The federal agents had seen my signal. I managed to touch the blinds when he first pulled out the device. Everything happened very fast after that. Agents poured through the front door, the device went flying across the room, and suddenly I was surrounded by people in bulletproof vests telling me I was safe. They arrested him right there in the hallway where he'd tried to erase me one final time. As they were putting him in handcuffs, he looked at me and said he was sorry. Said he really did love me, that I'd been the best daughter he could have asked for. I think that might have been the only true thing he ever said to me. That was 6 months ago. The federal investigation is still ongoing, but they've found 4 other victims so far. Adults now, like me, who were taken as children and conditioned into new identities. Some of them had their memories return when their suppression devices failed. Others are still living as the people they were programmed to be, not knowing their real identities. One of them was activated and used as an agent before the program was shut down. She spent 5 years infiltrating an organization overseas, believing she was a loyal operative when she was really just a kidnapped child with an implanted personality. The man I'd called father pled guilty to avoid a trial. He's serving life in prison without parole. I haven't visited him, and I don't plan to. Some of the other victims have chosen to maintain relationships with their kidnappers. Apparently it's not uncommon in cases like this, but I can't. Every time I think about him, I remember that device in his hand and the way he looked at me like I was just a problem to be solved. Living with my real parents has been an adjustment. I'm not the 3-year-old they lost, and they're not the same people they were 15 years ago. We're all different now, shaped by trauma and loss and years of grief. But we're learning to be a family again. I'm remembering more about my early childhood every day, not just the suppressed memories, but new details that surface when I smell certain foods or hear particular songs. My mother has been incredibly patient, helping me piece together who I was before the conditioning. I still have the bracelet. The federal agents gave it back to me after they finished studying it. I keep it in a drawer in my bedroom, not because I want to wear it again, but because I need to remember what it represents. How easy it is to lose yourself, how precious memory and identity really are. Sometimes I wonder who I would have been if none of this had happened. What kind of person would I be now if I'd grown up with my real parents, if I'd been allowed to develop naturally instead of being shaped by lies and conditioning? But then I realized that wondering about alternate versions of myself is just another kind of prison. I am who I am now, part the child who was stolen, part the person who was created through conditioning, part the woman who fought to reclaim her identity. I'm not the daughter my real parents lost, and I'm not the daughter my kidnapper tried to create. I'm something entirely my own, and for the first time in my life, that feels like enough. The other victims and I have started meeting regularly. We call ourselves the Reset Survivors, which sounds dramatic but feels right. We're the only people who understand what it's like to discover that your entire identity was manufactured, that your memories were edited, that the people you trusted most were the ones controlling your mind. We help each other navigate the strange reality of reclaimed identity. We share techniques for strengthening recovered memories, for dealing with the guilt and confusion, for building relationships with biological families who are essentially strangers. Most importantly, we remind each other that we survived. We broke free from the conditioning, we fought for our real selves, and we won. I still get headaches sometimes when I'm stressed, phantom echoes of the electromagnetic conditioning. I still have nightmares about that device, about losing myself again. But every morning when I wake up, I remember my real name, my real history, my real family. And that's enough. That's everything.